They may be powerful, but central banks are not immune from political pressure. After all, the nations of the Euro area, the United States, and Japan are all democracies. For evidence of political pressure, we need only consult the media. In a story on February 13th, 2011, the New York Times suggests that European politics, more than credentials and experience, would determine the successor to Jean-Claude Trichet as president of the European Central Bank. On February 6th, 2011, an article described Mervyn King, the governor of the Bank of England, as donnish, making light of his academic credentials, and suggested that King was neither loved nor respected in the United Kingdom. Why? The article explained that King was condemned for, quote, flouting the bank's independence by publicly supporting the British government's deficit-cutting strategy, end quote. And a bit earlier, on November 16, 2010, the New York Times described the Federal Reserve as, quote, under attack at home and abroad, end quote, over its decision to buy $600 billion of Treasury securities of all maturities in an effort to stimulate what the Times called a sagging economy. This story, too, commented on an attack against Federal Reserve independence. Again, I quote, one worry of Fed watchers, as well as its defenders, is that some of the domestic criticism may have the subtext of challenging the Fed's traditional independence in deciding monetary policy without political interference, end quote. It is one thing to realize that central banks are not immune from the give and take of politics. But it's a very different thing to ask whether they should be immune. Now, one might argue that in a democracy, no institution should be immune from the will of the people. And because of that, the central bank should be part of the political process. On the other hand, many economists believe that unless the central bank is independent and immune from political pressures, bad outcomes will result. In today's lecture, I will first set out the case for central bank independence using a little bit of theory and some empirical evidence from a very influential paper. I will then drill down and ask more precisely what scholars mean by independence of a central bank. Next, I will present a statistical analysis that quantifies the independence of central banks of the world and asks whether greater independence is associated with desirable outcomes. And finally, I will explain that more recent work on the importance of independence has taken a turn in the direction of emphasizing the importance of central bank transparency. The traditional argument for central bank independence is that independence is necessary if a central bank is to keep inflation low and steady. Without independence, central banks are more likely to succumb to pressure to provide more stimulus to the economy than would be consistent with low and steady inflation. An important part of the argument for central bank independence depends on the model that was created by economists Robert Barro and David Gordon. Now, this is not the only model that implies that central bank independence is a good thing, but it is a model that captures an important argument which has been made in many places and in many different ways. Now, again, don't worry about the model itself. Don't get hung up on the equations I present. The intuition for the result is strong, and I guarantee you I will make it clear. But it is nice to see the argument formalized by using a model. Okay. The point of this model is to show in a simple way how political pressure can lead to inflation. The model has two equations. The first equation explains the connection between unemployment and inflation. The equation says that the unemployment rate at some time t, which we'll designate as u with t in parentheses, is related to a magnitude I will call u bar. That is the natural rate of unemployment. And by the natural rate of unemployment, I mean the rate of unemployment that would occur in long-run equilibrium when resources were fully employed. It's kind of a magnetic unemployment rate that draws the economy in the long run to itself. It is not zero. The natural rate of unemployment is not zero because in full employment, some people would be leaving jobs for a variety of reasons and in search of other jobs. And given the way we measure unemployment, they would be counted as unemployed during that transition period. Our equation says that unemployment is equal to that U bar, the natural rate, with another factor added in. And that second factor represents the influence of policy. The argument in that equation is the actual inflation rate minus what individuals expected it to be. The actual inflation rate is pi. The expected inflation rate is pi with a little e there to remind us that it's expected. And pi minus pi e is called an inflation surprise. When the Fed begins to stimulate the economy, it generally creates an inflation surprise, and that has stimulative effects. The idea is that the Fed stimulates the economy by lowering interest rates and raising demand for goods and services, and that higher than expected inflation is a proxy in the equation for the demand stimulus. Now, some of you who have studied economics will recognize the equation I just showed you as a version of the so-called Phillips curve, an equation that embodies an idea set out many years ago by economist William Phillips. Phillips observed in the data that increases in wage inflation are generally associated with decreases in unemployment. And many economists since then have expanded Phillips' idea and related unemployment not to wage inflation but to inflation generally. The reason for the inverse relationship is that inflation surprises are associated with increased stimulus from monetary policy that increases total economic demand and leads to higher employment of all resources, including labor, and therefore is associated with lower labor unemployment rates. Okay, is that equation everything there is to say about unemployment? Of course not. Is this equation literally true? Of course not. Does this equation capture something that economists believe is essentially true? Yes, it does. That in the short run at least, Stimulus supplied to the economy by monetary policy can change the rate of unemployment. And how strong is the effect of inflation surprises and therefore monetary policy on unemployment? Well, we capture that with parameter alpha, Greek letter alpha, because Greek letter alpha measures the rate at which unemployment falls as the inflation rate rises above its expected value. Okay? So that's a parameter describing the strength of the relationship between surprising inflation and unemployment. The second equation is very interesting and very easy to understand. The second equation sets out the objectives of the Federal Reserve in the form of something that economists call a loss function. This equation says that there are two sources of loss, or bad, unemployment and inflation. That I could have said without an equation, but Barrow and Gordon grade monetary policy by using this loss function, so it's necessary to lay it out in a formal way to appreciate their contribution. Barrow and Gordon, and most economists, would simply say that a policy that achieves a lower value of L, standing for loss, is a better policy. Now, the relative distaste of the Federal Reserve for inflation is captured by the loss function parameter B, and that's a positive number. If the Federal Reserve hates inflation much more than it dislikes unemployment, B will be a very large positive number. We don't know what it is, but we know that it would be very large. On the other hand, if the Fed hates inflation less than it hates unemployment, B will still be positive, but it will be much, much smaller, certainly less than 1 and maybe much less than 1. Now, I promised you a model that would allow us to talk about political pressure, and I have one. I am capturing the strength of political pressure with the parameter little k. Notice that little k enters into the loss function by governing the size of the natural rate of unemployment that's subtracted from unemployment in computing the loss due to unemployment. Now, if k equals 1, then the Federal Reserve is under no political pressure. Why? Because it's simply supposed to keep the unemployment rate near to the natural rate of unemployment. Okay? Yes, if the unemployment arises above U bar, that's a bad. But in the long run, the Fed is under no political pressure to keep unemployment below the rate that market forces would take it to. In that case, bliss for the Federal Reserve would be unemployment staying at its steady state natural rate. If unemployment could only stay there, the Fed would be blissful. But, and here comes the political pressure part, if we model K, if we set K to less than 1, then the Fed is being pressured by political forces to stabilize unemployment around a rate smaller than the economy is capable of generating in the long run. If the natural rate is 6%, it perhaps is the case that political pressure forces the Fed to try to stabilize around 5% or even 4%. The smaller is that parameter K, the stronger is the political pressure. Again, have I captured political pressure perfectly in this model? Of course not. But have I introduced political pressure in a cogent and realistic way? You bet. The idea that political pressure would be trying to get the Fed to keep unemployment lower than the economy itself could do in the long run is certainly something that is the result of political pressure. Political pressure may do something else, but it certainly does that. Okay, we're going to assume now that the Federal Reserve exercises discretion, doesn't follow a rule, and treats every single economic situation as unique. And for the sake of simplicity, we're going to assume that the Federal Reserve uses the actual inflation rate as its policy instrument. Hold on, don't be too upset by that. We know that, in fact, the Fed chooses the money growth rate or the federal funds rate as its instrument. And we know that the Federal Reserve will thereby influence the inflation rate. But my assumption that the Fed chooses the inflation rate as its policy instrument simply keeps the model simple without invalidating the model's conclusions. In other words, we could say that the Federal Reserve actually is going to change the federal funds rate until it gets the inflation rate that it wants. But I'm going to fast track that and simply say that the Fed chooses the inflation rate. Now, discretion implies that the Fed does not take into account the implications of its policy decisions on private inflation expectations. That's what discretion means. The Fed's best policy under these assumptions is the following choice for the inflation rate. You're seeing it now in equation form, and I realize it's somewhat complicated. I want you to notice one and only one thing. If K is between 0 and 1, okay, if there is political pressure, inflation will be higher than it would be in the case of no political pressure, where K would equal 1. Political pressure causes the Fed to raise the inflation rate. Okay? That's important. But our analysis does not stop at that point. We can go further. Keep in mind that private decision makers have an incentive to forecast the inflation rate accurately. And Barrow and Gordon go on to ask what would happen over time as private expectations adjust to what the Fed is actually doing. Now, just as a benchmark to see where the economy would end up, they ask what would happen when decision makers' forecasts finally fully caught up with Federal Reserve behavior so that they were now correct and expected pi with the E on it, was actually equal to pi. In that case, we're going to have a very interesting result, a very, very interesting result. The result is called the inflation bias result. When private expectations are correct, the unemployment rate equals its natural level. The Fed is fully thwarted in attempting to keep unemployment below the natural level. But the inflation rate is positive whenever K is less than 1. That is, as long as political pressure induces the Fed to try to lower the unemployment rate below its natural level, we will have inflation, but no real effects of that aggressive monetary policy. And you should notice by, again, looking at the equation, that the inflation bias persists no matter how large is B, that parameter that summarizes Fed dislike for inflation. If K is less than 1, we're getting inflation no matter how big B is. But if we think of an independent central bank as a central bank for which K equals 1, that is where the Federal Reserve is able to ignore the pressure to lower unemployment below the natural rate, the equation shows us that there will be no inflation bias. These are very interesting theoretical results, but they're also supported by empirical research. In 1993, Alberto Alesina and Lawrence Summers provided evidence that confirmed the connection between central bank independence and inflation. Alesina and Summers defined what it meant for a central bank to be independent, constructed a statistical index of central bank independence, and then examined the connection between central bank independence and inflation. Their findings are summarized by the diagram you're looking at now. The diagram shows a clear inverse relationship between central bank independence and the average rate of inflation over the period 1955 to 1988. A second diagram shows a clear inverse relationship between central bank independence and inflation variability. So Alesina and Summers show that banks that are highly independent exist in countries which have low average inflation and low inflation variability, two very desirable outcomes. Notice in the diagrams that the USA fares well in both. The Fed is judged by Alesina and Summers to be among the most independent of the central banks for that period and to have low inflation and low inflation variation over the period, relative to the outcomes of the other developed economies. Okay, but what makes a central bank independent? Two researchers, Crow and Mead, explain that there are four aspects of central bank independence that depend on the legal statutes that create the central bank and define its mandate. They argue that central banks are more independent when, first, central bank management is insulated from political pressure. How? By secure tenure and independence of appointments. Central banks are more independent when the government cannot participate or overturn central bank policy decisions. The central bank is more independent when the central bank's legal mandate specifies a clearly defined objective for monetary policy. And finally, a central bank is more independent when it has financial independence in the sense that its own funding does not depend on the government. Crow and Mead study how central bank independence has changed since the 1980s across 72 countries. For each country, they compute a statistical measure of central bank independence. And in the table you're going to be looking at, that measure of central bank independence is designated X. That measure varies between 0, which is very low independence, and 1, which is very high independence. So they keep X between 0 and 1. And their findings are summarized in the table that you're looking at. The results show a dramatic move toward central bank independence among both advanced and non-advanced country groups. Average independence has risen from 0.3 in the 1980s to 0.6 in 2003. The European Central Bank has a measure of independence of 0.83. The Swedish Riksbank has a measure of 0.85, and these two are ranked the most independent among the central banks of the advanced nations. The Federal Reserve has a score of 0.48, virtually the same in 2003 as in the 1980s. In the 1980s, the Fed was more independent than the average central bank. Now it's less independent than the average central bank. Why does the Fed score low relative to others? The Fed score is low relative to the average because, in part, of the dual mandate that the Federal Reserve faces. Many central banks have moved to the single mandate of price stability. The Fed is also less independent because members of the Board of Governors are chosen by the President rather than by the Federal Reserve itself. The Fed is also judged to be less independent because the Fed plays no statutory role in the government budget process. Interestingly, the big increase in independence occurred in Poland, where the National Bank of Poland moved from a score of 0.1 in the 1980s to 0.9 in 2003. Crow and Mead show that the movement toward greater central bank independence and the onset of the Great Moderation in inflation that began in the late 1980s have removed the negative correlation between independence and inflation reported earlier by Alesina and Summers. The diagram shows the relationship between average inflation between 2000 and 2004 as a function of central bank independence in 2003. It shows that the great majority of nations experienced low inflation rates, and that the few cases of higher inflation seem uncorrelated with the independence measure. How do I interpret these results? Well, to me, these results imply that the nations of the world have largely exploited the opportunities to lower inflation by raising central bank independence that Alesina and Summers' work showed were available. It will be interesting to learn whether the negative correlation between inflation and independence somehow reemerges as economies begin growing again after the Great Recession. Crow and Mead do find a relationship between central bank transparency and inflation. What's that mean? Well, a central bank is more transparent when it does a better job of communicating its intentions to the public, and thereby reduces public uncertainty about what the central bank is trying to achieve and how it will try to achieve its ends. Crow and Mead construct a statistical measure of central bank transparency using data that would allow them to measure transparency for a large number of central banks and allow them to compare changes in transparency between the 1980s and the present. They were able to obtain sufficient data to construct transparency measures for 37 different central banks. There are some very interesting findings. Inflation targeting central banks were judged to be more transparent than banks with other mandates, including the Fed. Interestingly, the European Central Bank has below average transparency because it discloses much less information than is disclosed by central banks that have committed to inflation targeting. Now, the Fed made many changes in its communication practices between 1993 and 2004 that were designed to make its policy announcements more transparent. Crow and Mead point out that there is one downside to transparency. For example, once the Fed began publishing verbatim transcripts of FOMC meetings in 1993, the result may have been that members of the FOMC may have spoken less frankly about their views and especially about their reservations. Crow and Mead find that increased transparency leads on average to a small decline in average inflation, but the effect is not as large or as precisely estimated as the relationship found between inflation and independence by Alesina and Summers that I talked about earlier. Is the Federal Reserve Bank of the United States sufficiently independent? In this lecture, I have shown that by objective measures, the Fed is now less independent than the average central bank. Should we take steps to change and maybe increase Fed independence? Events during the subprime mortgage crisis and the Great Contraction gave conflicting signals on central bank independence. On the one hand, as one of our lecture opening headlines indicated, the Fed frequently came under strong political pressure to explain its policy actions. The headline specifically refers to QE2, the second round of Fed's quantitative easing program, in which it committed to purchase long maturity Treasury securities. On the other hand, and unlike Alan Greenspan before him, Ben Bernanke spoke out on questions of fiscal policy, a sign of greater independence. On February 3, 2011, the New York Times reported that Bernanke warned congressional Republicans not to play around with a coming vote to raise the government's legal borrowing limit. Is that a sign that Ben Bernanke and the Federal Reserve are sufficiently independent? Time will tell. Thank you very much.